It was supposed to break the deadlock. Instead, it became the bloodiest day in British military history. July 1st, 1916. 57,000 men fell before noon. This wasn't a battle. It was a lesson in arrogance, a machine that ground a generation into the mud of northern France. You've heard of World War I, but you've never seen it like this. What happened at the Somme wasn't strategy. It was sacrifice, and it changed everything. The year was 1916. Europe was drowning in blood, but no side could claim victory. On the Western Front, the British and French forces had been locked in a cruel deadlock with the Germans for nearly 2 years. Trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a maze of mud, barbed wire, and suffering. Every yard of ground had been paid for in flesh. But behind the front lines, generals were not preparing for more of the same. They were planning something bigger, something that would finally break the deadlock. For the French, that plan had been Verdun. In February 1916, German forces launched a massive offensive there, hoping to bleed France dry. The French clung to the city with a ferocity that stunned even their enemies, but it came at a price. By spring, French commanders were exhausted. They begged their British allies to take the pressure off. The British Expeditionary Force under General Sir Douglas Haig had no choice. The British agreed to launch a major offensive further north, along the River Somme. The plan was simple: overwhelm the German lines with artillery, then sweep through the broken front with infantry and cavalry. Haig believed it could be the decisive blow, a war winner. But the ground they chose was not ideal. The Somme region held deep chalk soil, open ridges, and strong German defensive lines. The enemy had spent the last year digging in, reinforcing bunkers, and stringing barbed wire across no man's land. They were ready. The British weren't. At the start of the war, Britain had a small professional army. By 1916, that army had been largely replaced by volunteers, men who answered Kitchener's call to arms. Entire towns sent groups of young men together in what became known as Pals battalions. Friends, brothers, co-workers. They trained together. They would fight and die together. These were not career soldiers. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger. But in the months leading up to the battle, they trained relentlessly, dug trenches, carried supplies, waited. By late June, nearly 500,000 British and French soldiers were in position for the coming offensive. Artillery pieces, over 1,400 of them, were hauled into place. Ammunition dumps piled up by the thousands. The first day of the assault would be unlike anything the British Army had ever attempted. The generals believed in science, in statistics, in engineering. The theory was simple. If you fire enough shells, the enemy cannot survive. So, for 7 days straight, the Allied artillery opened fire, day and night. More than 1.5 million shells rained down on the German lines. The roar was constant. Entire hillsides trembled. It was the largest bombardment in British history. Many officers believed no German soldier could live through it. They called it the Week of Fire. But underground, the Germans had survived. Their bunkers were deep, reinforced with concrete. Many were 30 feet below ground. When the bombardment began, they simply went down and waited. When it ended, they came back up, with machine guns loaded and fields of fire memorized. The British believed they were marching into a broken line. They were marching into a slaughterhouse. This was the road to the Somme. A road paved with confidence, built on flawed assumptions, and fueled by the desperate hope that this time, they could break through. But as July 1st approached, the men in the trenches did not speak like strategists. They wrote letters to mothers, kissed photographs of wives, and whispered prayers no one would ever hear again. The guns were still roaring. But soon, the silence between the shells would be broken by a whistle, and then they would climb. The night before July 1st, 1916, was quiet, eerily so. After 7 days of deafening bombardment, the silence felt unnatural. Some British soldiers mistook it for victory. Others, with more experience or sharper instincts, knew better. In the trenches, men prepared in silence. Rifles were cleaned, letters were sealed. Pocket Bibles, rosaries, and lucky coins were tucked into tunics. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the attack would begin. A whistle would blow, and nearly 120,000 British soldiers would go over the top across a 20-mile front. But beneath that courage was a fatal error in strategy. British command believed their artillery had wiped out most of the German defenders. The plan was for soldiers to advance slowly in long, straight lines. They were ordered to walk, not run. Officers feared that charging would break formation and cause chaos. But that caution, on this battlefield, would be deadly. What they didn't know was this: the week-long shelling had failed. Yes, some German positions were destroyed, but many others, especially along the ridges and deep dugouts, had survived. The British fired too many shrapnel shells designed to kill infantry. What they needed were high-explosive shells to destroy trenches and wire. Much of the German barbed wire still stood. The machine guns were untouched, and the Germans were waiting. At 7:20 a.m., a massive underground mine exploded beneath the German strongpoint at Hawthorne Ridge. British engineers had spent months digging beneath enemy lines to place thousands of pounds of explosives. The blast threw earth and men hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion could be heard across the Channel in England. And yet, it was not the breakthrough they hoped for. 10 minutes later, the whistles blew. British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began to walk across no man's land. Many had never seen real combat. Some smiled, others recited psalms under their breath. A few thought the war would be over by afternoon. Some carried heavy packs weighing over 60 pounds. They moved in lines, shoulder to shoulder, heads high, just as they had practiced. Then the German machine guns opened fire. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was planned, rehearsed, precise. German soldiers, sheltered from the shelling, sprang into position and unleashed a torrent of bullets from carefully sighted positions. The sound was unbearable. Entire rows of men were cut down before reaching the halfway mark. Others became tangled in barbed wire and were mown down as they struggled to escape. The 1st Battalion of the Newfoundland Regiment went over the top at 8:45 a.m. Out of 800 men, only 68 were able to answer roll call the next morning. One entire generation of a small colony almost vanished in a single hour. At Thiepval, Serre, Beaumont, Hamel, Mametz, and La Boiselle, the story was the same. Men advanced, were caught in open fire, and died where they stood. The German lines had not broken. They were killing zones, engineered for maximum destruction. Some battalions suffered over 90% casualties. In certain sectors, not a single man reached the German trenches. By nightfall, the British Army had suffered more than 57,000 casualties, 19,240 of them dead. It was the bloodiest single day in British military history. The soldiers who survived that first day were not the same men who had woken up that morning. They had seen bodies torn open by shell fire, friends slumped in wire, limbs scattered across fields. Some had spent the night in shell holes, wounded, listening to the cries of the dying. And the battle had only just begun. The first day was supposed to break the German line. Instead, it broke the illusion that this war could still be won by clever plans or heroic charges. But Haig did not call off the offensive. He could not. The stakes were too high. So the killing continued. Day after day, week after week, the Battle of the Somme dragged on. not as a single battle, but as a brutal, grinding series of assaults. Small villages became household names: Delville Wood, High Wood, Pozieres, Guillemont, and Flers-Courcelette. Each one turned into a separate hell. The weather turned. Summer heat gave way to drenching rain. Trenches collapsed. Shell holes became lakes. Rats grew fat on the dead. The wounded lay in mud, sometimes for days, their cries swallowed by artillery. Men lived ankle-deep in water, their feet rotting, their minds unraveling. The Somme had become a machine that fed on flesh and spat out ghosts. But still, the orders came. Take that ridge, seize that trench, hold that wood. The British shifted tactics. They experimented with creeping barrages, where artillery fire moved forward slowly ahead of the troops, trying to pin down the enemy. In theory, it was sound. In practice, it demanded perfect coordination, and many times, it failed. When it worked, the gains were measured in yards, and those yards cost hundreds of lives. Then came something new. On September 15, 1916, at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, the British unleashed a new weapon, the tank. Massive, iron-plated beasts that rumbled forward like beasts from a nightmare. The soldiers called them land ships. The Germans were stunned. Fear rippled through their lines. But the tanks were slow, unreliable. Many broke down before reaching the front. Others became stuck in craters, or mechanical failure rendered them useless. The impact was more psychological than strategic. Still, the future of warfare had changed. But it would not change the outcome at the Somme. The French, fighting on the southern sector, had more success. They used shorter, focused attacks. They gained ground, but they too paid in blood. Their forces were still reeling from Verdun. They were exhausted, hollowed out. And the Germans, their defense had been brutal but effective. They constructed fallback lines, strong points, and reserve trenches deeper into their territory. Even when they lost ground, they bled the attackers dry. Some divisions fought with incredible discipline. Others cracked under the weight of constant shelling. Both sides were barely human by October. Yet, for the generals, success was measured in yards. Each captured wood, every battered village, was presented as progress. But the men knew better. They were taking the same positions again and again, places already soaked in the blood of their comrades. For the infantrymen, time no longer moved. There was only the next objective, the next shell, the next scream. The Somme was no longer a battle. It was a meat grinder, a ritual sacrifice to a war that had lost all reason. And still it went on. By October 1916, the Somme had devoured more than just men. It had consumed belief. Belief in strategy, belief in command, belief that any of it meant something. But the orders still came. The mud was no longer just thick. It was alive. It pulled at boots like hands from the underworld. Men drowned in shell holes. Guns sank into the mire. Horses collapsed and had to be shot in place. Equipment rusted where it lay. Everything rotted, including sanity. And yet the machine ground on. In Delville Wood, South African troops held their position for 6 straight days under constant bombardment. Out of 3,000 men, only 750 walked out. Their hands shook. Their eyes stared past everything. That place became known as the Devil's Wood, and the name fit. At Thiepval Ridge, the Ulster Division attacked on the first day of July and made it farther than almost any other unit. They breached the German lines, fighting hand to hand, but support never came. They were surrounded and cut down. When their bodies were recovered weeks later, many were found still clutching photographs of home. In Gaudecourt and Le Tremblay, the battle turned inward. Morale began to break. Men followed orders but without hope. The rifle fire was slower, the charges more hesitant. Fear was no longer the driving force, resignation was. The Germans too were breaking. Their front lines were collapsing under the weight of continuous bombardment. They rotated divisions constantly, but they held. They knew the terrain, their commanders adapted, and they understood the art of defense. But they paid in blood. Some German units suffered 90% losses. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Shell shock began to appear on both sides. Men who could no longer speak, who twitched and screamed without reason, who laughed at nothing. Medical stations overflowed. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. The stench of antiseptic could not hide the deeper odor of infection, gas gangrene, and human decay. Commanders pressed on. Haig still believed that pressure would crack the German line, that one final push would force them into collapse, that the slaughter would be justified by the breakthrough that never came. But there was no breakthrough. Just movement, just more men disappearing into woods already filled with corpses. Villages taken and lost and taken again. Places with names that meant nothing to the men who died there. For many soldiers, this was the final truth. They would not survive. They knew it, and they accepted it. They cleaned their rifles, wrote to loved ones, and stepped back into the line. This was not glory. This was not triumph. This was war stripped bare, cold, mechanical, senseless. The Somme had become a ritual of endurance, and the only way out was death, or the slow, brutal passing of time. By November, the Somme battlefield had become a graveyard that moved. Every ridge, every shattered tree, every flooded trench was soaked in death. The offensive had lasted over 4 months, yet there was no victory to speak of, just the slow hemorrhage of an entire generation. And still, the orders continued. Men no longer looked up when the shells came. They didn't flinch at screams. They didn't cry at the sight of torn flesh. They had run out of emotion, out of disbelief. What remained was a numb obedience to a world that no longer felt real. In places like Beaumont-Hamel and the Butte de Warlencourt, the final assaults unfolded like repetitions of a cruel ritual. The ground had already been fought over, already cost thousands of lives, but now it had to be taken again. Mud was no longer a condition, it was an enemy. Some trenches had no bottom. Men stood for hours in waist-deep water, legs numb, rifles jammed. Wounds refused to heal. Trench foot turned to gangrene. Frostbite set in. Men lost toes, then feet, then the will to walk. The wounded were pulled back when possible, but often they were left behind. Stretcher bearers crawled through shell fire, dragging broken bodies back across ground that offered no cover. Some died with the wounded still in their arms. In the last weeks of the battle, snow began to fall. It covered the churned earth, the mangled corpses, the broken guns. For a moment, the battlefield looked still, white, pure. But underneath, nothing had changed. The soil was black. The air still reeked of cordite and decay. By November 18, 1916, the battle was officially called off. In total, over 1 million men had been killed or wounded. The British alone had suffered more than 400,000 casualties. The French over 200,000. The Germans perhaps 500,000. Entire villages in Britain would never recover. In some towns, every name on the war memorial belonged to a man who fell at the Somme. And what was gained? A few miles of ruined ground. No breakthrough, no decisive victory. Just a slow German withdrawal to new positions deeper inside France. Haig called it a success. The line had moved. German manpower had been weakened. Some historians agree, others call it a crime of ambition, a failure of imagination, paid for in blood. But the truth doesn't lie in reports. It lies in the faces of men who returned. Many never spoke of what they'd seen. Not to wives, not to children, Some walked with a limp, some with a blank stare that never left. Others never came home at all, not in any way that mattered. This was the Somme. Not a battle, but a revelation. That war could become industrial, that men could become material, that nations could lose their soul and not even realize it. The guns eventually fell silent. The fields hardened with frost, and the names of places like Mametz Wood, Tival and Delville slipped from the lips of survivors into the silence of history. But the Somme did not end when the fighting stopped. Its shadow never really left. In Britain, the losses rippled through every town. The PALS battalions, once symbols of patriotic pride, had become symbols of national mourning. Entire communities lost their sons in a single day. There were towns where not a single young man returned. In the years that followed, memorials began to rise. Stone tablets, marble statues, silent figures in bronze. But no monument could match the weight of what was lost. What the Somme had destroyed was not just bodies, but belief. Belief in leaders, belief in victory, belief that war had any nobility left. Many survivors never spoke of it. Others tried to, but no words could capture what they had seen. The British officer and poet Siegfried Sassoon called the war a lie, a slaughterhouse run by men too proud to admit defeat. Wilfred Owen, killed just 1 week before the war's end, wrote poems that still echo with horror, the gasps of the dying, the haunted march of the survivors. The Somme became a symbol of industrialized killing, of the futility of modern warfare, of a generation scarred beyond repair. And yet, from a military standpoint, debates continued. Some historians argue that the Somme weakened the German army so badly that it set the stage for eventual Allied victory, that it forced the Germans to abandon their own offensives and shift to the defensive, that it taught the Allies how to fight a war they never truly understood until it was too late. Others disagree. They see in the Somme only waste, lives fed into a war machine run by commanders trapped in outdated thinking, strategies that ignored reality, plans that sacrificed flesh for fantasy. But perhaps the true legacy of the Somme lies not in numbers or tactics, but in memory. The white gravestones that stretch across northern France, the preserved trenches at Beaumont-Hamel, the red poppies worn each November, the silence that falls at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month. The Somme taught the modern world a brutal truth, that progress does not make us wiser, that technology can serve both creation and destruction, that men can be led into death by ideals no one remembers later. But it also left behind something deeper, a wound that never quite healed, a reminder carved into the earth and into our collective conscience. So that when we speak of war again, we do so with caution, with reverence, and with the question echoing behind every word: was it worth it?